Picture this midnight in the heart of a once grand palace, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. Outside, the streets echo with the furious chants of revolution, the clatter of muskets, the crackle of flames devouring symbols of a crumbling regime. Inside, a royal family moves in hushed desperation, their jewels sewn into the linings of plain coats, their faces obscured by shadows. This is no scene from a film, it's history, raw and real. Across centuries, when revolutions erupted and thrones trembled, monarchs and aristocrats faced a single, harrowing question: escape or perish. Some vanished into the night, disguised as servants or merchants. Others fled across borders with nothing but their titles and the clothes on their backs. Their stories are more than mere footnotes. They're gripping sagas of survival, where the line between power and peril blurred in an instant. What does it take for a king or queen to abandon everything: their palaces, their people, even their identities, just to stay alive? Imagine the weight of that decision, the whispered planning, the last glance at a gilded hall, the crushing realization that the world you knew is gone forever. These escapes weren't just about physical survival. They were acts of reinvention, where crowns were traded for cloaks and sovereignty for secrecy. From the French Revolution's blood-soaked streets to the fall of empires in the 20th century, these flight plans were as daring as they were desperate. Some succeeded, slipping through enemy lines with breathtaking cunning. Others met tragic ends, their fates sealing the doom of dynasties. This is the hidden side of royal history, not the pomp and pageantry, but the moments when privilege became a prison and escape was the only option. Today, we're diving into these extraordinary true stories of monarchs on the run. You'll hear about the smuggled letters, the double agents, the midnight rides across hostile borders. You'll discover how queens disguised themselves as peasants, how princes bribed their way to freedom, and how some were betrayed by those they trusted most. These tales aren't just about the fallen powerful, they're about the resilience of the human spirit when everything is on the line. So settle in, because what follows is a journey through history's most heart-pounding royal escapes, where every second counted, and one misstep could change the course of a kingdom. Revolutions don't just topple governments, they unravel the very fabric of monarchy, turning rulers into fugitives overnight. Take the French Revolution, where the once untouchable Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette found themselves trapped in their own palace, surrounded by a nation that had once bowed to them. The same gilded halls that hosted their lavish balls became prisons, the cheers of loyal subjects replaced by the roar of angry mobs. In a matter of months, the divine right of kings crumbled under the weight of hunger, inequality, and fury. The royal family's failed escape attempt, the infamous flight to Varennes, exposed just how fragile their power had become. Disguised as servants, they were caught and dragged back to Paris, their humiliation sealing their fate. The Russian Revolution followed a similar script, only with colder winds and bloodier endings. Tsar Nicholas II, who had ruled as an absolute monarch, watched his authority dissolve like ice in spring. Strikes, mutinies, and bread riots spiraled into full-scale rebellion, and the Romanovs, once seen as God's chosen rulers, became prisoners in their own country. Stripped of their titles, they were shuffled between makeshift prisons, their every move dictated by revolutionary guards. Their final escape attempt never even came. Instead, they met a grim end in a basement in Yekaterinburg, their deaths marking the brutal finality of revolution. What makes monarchy so vulnerable in these upheavals? Unlike elected leaders, kings and queens embody the state itself. Their bodies, their bloodlines, their very existence symbolize the old order. When people rise up, they don't just want change. They want to erase the system entirely, and that means removing the monarchy's living symbols. and it's not just about politics, it's personal. Royals are raised to believe in their own invincibility, surrounded by courtiers who reinforce their power. When revolution hits, they're often the last to grasp how dangerous their situation has become. But the most chilling lesson: no throne is ever truly secure. For every monarch who escaped, like Queen Marie of Romania, who fled Bucharest in a train car stuffed with gold and art, there were others who hesitated too long, trusted the wrong people, or underestimated the tide of history. Revolutions don't negotiate, they don't compromise, and for royals trapped in their path, the only choices are flight, surrender, or ruin. Marie Antoinette's escape plan should have been foolproof. The Queen of France, dressed as a Russian baroness, her husband Louis XVI disguised as a lowly valet. Their carriage was ordinary, their route meticulously planned, their timing calculated to avoid suspicion. But history remembers it as the flight to Varennes, a disaster so spectacular it sealed their doom. The royal family's attempt to flee Paris in June 1791 wasn't just a failed getaway, it was a turning point that exposed their disconnect from reality and fueled the revolution's fury. The plan was born from desperation. By 1791, the French Revolution had stripped the monarchy of its power, and the royal family lived as prisoners in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by hostile guards. Their allies urged them to escape to the northeastern fortress of Montmédy, where loyal troops could protect them. Every detail was plotted: the lightweight carriage to avoid drawing attention, the Queen's maid posing as a noblewoman to explain their wealth, even the King's decision to wear a plain brown coat. But arrogance and hesitation doomed them from the start. Louis insisted on bringing a mountain of luggage, including a silver traveling wine set, slowing the carriage to a crawl. He refused to leave behind his beloved sister, Madame Elisabeth, adding another recognizable face to their group. Worst of all, they delayed their departure by hours, waiting for the Queen to finish her lengthy toilette. That delay meant their carefully timed relay of fresh horses fell apart, leaving them stranded with exhausted animals. Then came the fatal mistake when their carriage was stopped in the small town of Varennes. Louis, instead of ordering the driver to push through, meekly submitted to inspection. A local postmaster recognized the King's profile from coins in his pocket, and the jig was up. The family was dragged back to Paris, surrounded by jeering crowds, their humiliation complete. The people saw their escape as proof of treason. Why would a king abandon his subjects unless he planned to rally foreign armies against them? The failed flight turned public sympathy against the monarchy for good. Marie Antoinette's role in the fiasco reveals how out of touch she was. She had insisted on luxurious touches like a custom-built Berlin carriage, which drew suspicion. She ignored warnings about the king's indecisiveness, trusting that divine right would protect them, and in the end, her infamous reputation as Madame Déficit, the spendthrift queen who ignored France's suffering, made her the revolution's most hated symbol. The flight to Varennes didn't just fail, it became the revolution's propaganda coup, proving that monarchy was incompatible with the new France. Within 2 years, both Louis and Marie Antoinette would face the guillotine, their botched escape attempt a grim prelude to their fate. What's haunting about this story isn't just the missteps, it's the lingering question of whether they could have succeeded. Had they traveled lighter, left on time, or chosen a different route, might history have played out differently? But revolutions rarely offer second chances. The flight to Varennes stands as a stark lesson. When the people rise, even kings must run, and if they falter, the consequences are written in blood. The Romanov story is one of history's most tragic royal escapes, or rather, the escape that never happened. By 1917, Tsar Nicholas II and his family were no longer rulers of Russia. They were prisoners of the revolution, shuffled between decaying mansions under the watchful eyes of Bolshevik guards. Unlike Louis XVI's chaotic flight, the Romanovs never even made it to the planning stage. Their downfall was a slow, grinding process, where every glimmer of hope was crushed by political realities and their own unwavering denial. At first, their confinement seemed almost genteel. After Nicholas abdicated in March 1917, the provisional government placed the family under house arrest at the Alexander Palace, their lavish home outside St. Petersburg. They kept their servants, their routines, even the illusion of dignity, but as the Bolsheviks seized power that October, the noose tightened. The family was moved to Tobolsk, Siberia, a place so remote, their supporters struggled to find them. Even then, Nicholas wrote in his diary as if he were merely on a prolonged holiday, sketching the weather and his daily walks, seemingly blind to the danger. Monarchists across Europe scrambled to organize a rescue. British King George V, Nicholas's cousin, initially offered asylum, but political pressure forced him to withdraw the invitation. Other schemes bordered on the absurd, like the plot involving a group of officers who planned to smuggle the family out in coffins, pretending they died of disease. The most promising effort came from a monarchist sympathizer inside the Bolshevik ranks, who managed to sneak coded letters to the family, urging them to prepare for a nighttime extraction. But the Romanovs hesitated. Alexandra, the Tsarina, distrusted the messenger, while Nicholas clung to the belief that his people would never harm him. By the time they were transferred to Yekaterinburg in April 1918, it was too late. Their new prison, the Ipatiev House, was dubbed the House of Special Purpose, a chilling clue to their fate. Windows were painted white to block their view, guards mocked them openly, and the family's remaining jewels were sewn into the corsets of Nicholas's daughters, the only form of escape they'd ever attempt. The final blow came on the night of July 16th, when the entire family was led into a basement under the pretense of evacuation. Minutes later, a firing squad ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The bitter irony, just weeks after their deaths, anti-Bolshevik forces captured Yekaterinburg. Had the Romanovs held on a little longer, or had they trusted the rescue plans, history might have remembered them as survivors rather than martyrs. But revolutions show no mercy to those who wait. The Romanovs' tragedy wasn't just their execution, it was the missed chances, the fatal delays, and the devastating truth that sometimes the greatest royal escape is the one you never try. Among the countless lives shattered by the French Revolution, few deaths were as horrifying as that of Marie Thérèse Louise, Princess de Lamballe. She wasn't just another aristocrat, she was Marie Antoinette's closest confidante, the superintendent of the Queen's household, and a woman whose loyalty would cost her everything. When the revolution's fury reached its peak, the princess became a target not just for her rank, but for the vicious rumors that painted her as part of the Queen's so-called debauched inner circle. Her fate serves as a stomach-churning reminder of how quickly revolution can descend into bloodlust, and how those associated with royalty often faced the cruelest reprisals. The princess had every chance to save herself. In 1792, as mobs stormed Parisian prisons in the September massacres, she was offered a way out. Revolutionaries demanded she swear an oath against the monarchy, renouncing the king and queen she'd served for years. To them, it was a test. To her, it was unthinkable. She refused, declaring her loyalty to Marie Antoinette even as the crowd's rage boiled over. Within hours, she was dragged before a makeshift tribunal, condemned without trial, and hurled into the streets where a frenzied mob awaited. What followed wasn't just execution, it was spectacle. Her head was mounted on a pike and paraded beneath the windows of the Temple prison where Marie Antoinette was held, a grotesque gift to the Queen who had once called her friend. Some accounts even claim the mob forced the Queen to look upon the severed head, though historians debate this grisly detail. The brutality of Lamballe's death wasn't random, it was calculated terror. Revolutionaries understood the power of symbolism. By mutilating her body, reports describe even more unspeakable acts. They weren't just killing an aristocrat, they were desecrating the old world's ideals of beauty, refinement, and loyalty. The princess had represented everything the revolution sought to destroy: elegance without labor, privilege without merit, blind allegiance to a decaying crown. Her murder sent a clear message: no one connected to the monarchy was safe, not even those who posed no political threat. Yet there's a haunting contradiction in her story. The same princess accused of extravagance had quietly funded charities for poor children. The woman vilified as a libertine in pornographic revolutionary pamphlets was, by most accounts, a devoted wife who'd withdrawn from court after her husband's death, only returning out of duty to the Queen. The revolution didn't just kill Marie Thérèse Louise, it erased her humanity, turning her into a cautionary tale. Her death wasn't merely violence, it was performance, designed to sever past from present through sheer horror. In the end, the Princess de Lamballe's tragedy lies in what she represented to both sides. To the monarchy, she was proof of steadfast loyalty in an era of betrayal. To the revolution, she was a pawn to break the Queen's spirit, and to history, a chilling example of how easily ideals can twist into savagery when power changes hands. Her severed head wasn't just a warning to Marie Antoinette, it was a glimpse into the abyss that awaits when revolution forgets its own humanity. While so many monarchs met tragic ends during revolutions, France's last king proved escape was possible if you moved fast and shed your pride. Louis-Philippe's flight in 1848 stands in stark contrast to the bungled escapes of Louis XVI and the Romanovs, when Paris erupted in rebellion once again, this time against his bourgeois monarchy. The 64-year-old king didn't hesitate. Within hours, he traded his crown for a disguise and vanished into the chaos, pulling off one of history's most efficient royal disappearances. The difference: Louis-Philippe understood the stakes. Having grown up during the French Revolution's bloodshed his own father guillotined, he knew revolutions rarely spared kings. When barricades rose across Paris in February 1848, he didn't cling to divine right or waste time packing silverware. He acted, disguising himself as Mr. Smith, a bald, bespectacled English merchant complete with a fake passport. He slipped out of the Tuileries Palace through a servant's exit. His wife, Queen Marie Amélie, followed separately, both avoiding the grandiose carriages that had doomed Marie Antoinette. They traveled light, blending into the stream of refugees fleeing the city. Within days, they'd crossed the Channel to England, where Queen Victoria granted them asylum under discreet aliases. What made this escape work where others failed? Ruthless pragmatism. Louis-Philippe had spent his reign positioning himself as a citizen king, distancing himself from the extravagance of past monarchs. That image served him well in exile. No one expected the unassuming old man shuffling through Le Havre's docks to be royalty. He also benefited from timing. Unlike the Romanovs, trapped in a civil war, or Louis XVI, who waited until Paris was a powder keg, Louis-Philippe fled at the first whiff of irreversible revolt. Most crucially, he had allies outside France. British officials quietly smoothed his passage, proving that in exile politics, having friends abroad matters more than jewels sewn into your coat. Yet his success came with irony. The man who'd styled himself as the people's king spent his final years in an English country house, watching France lurch between republic and empire. His escape saved his life, but it also erased his legacy today. He's remembered less for his reign than for the quiet dignity of his exit. In the end, Louis-Philippe's story offers a bittersweet lesson. Sometimes, the smartest thing a monarch can do is know when to stop being a monarch. The Habsburgs didn't just lose an empire, they lost a world. When Austria-Hungary collapsed in 1918, the dynasty that had ruled Central Europe for 6 centuries shattered into fragments, its members scattering like leaves in a storm. Unlike the Romanovs, who faced concentrated Bolshevik fury, or the French royals, who fell to a single revolution, the Habsburgs' dispersal was a slow unraveling, a quiet erasure of power played out across half a dozen new nations. Some fled to Switzerland under assumed names, their titles reduced to whispered rumors. Others were arrested by Republican governments, their palaces seized, their very existence treated as a relic of a discredited past. The most tragic figure, Emperor Karl I, who refused to accept the end, dying in exile at 34 after 2 failed attempts to reclaim his Hungarian throne. Karl's story captures the Habsburg paradox, stubborn loyalty in an age that had moved on. Unlike Louis-Philippe, who embraced exile, Karl spent his final years scheming to return, even as his tuberculosis worsened. His wife, Zita, famously refused to pack mourning clothes when they fled Austria, convinced God would restore their throne. That faith led them to Switzerland, then Madeira, where Karl died in a damp cottage. His last words are whispered, "I must suffer like this so my people can come together again." To monarchists, he was a martyr. To the new republics, he was a deluded ghost. Yet other Habsburgs adapted with startling pragmatism. Archduke Joseph August, the dynasty's military hero, swore allegiance to Hungary's new government and kept his estates. Archduke Leopold secretly moved to Argentina, where he owned a brewery under the name Leopold Holzmann. And then there was Zita's own brother, Prince Xavier of Bourbon-Parma, who became a tractor salesman in France. Imagine, a man raised to rule, now haggling over farm equipment. These weren't just personal survival tactics, they were the death throes of an aristocratic system that had once governed by divine right. What makes the Habsburg exodus unique is its scale. This wasn't one family fleeing, it was dozens of archdukes, princesses and cousins, each choosing different paths. Some, like Karl's son Otto, would later become a European Parliament statesman, arguing for continental unity, as if trying to rebuild his empire through diplomacy. Others vanished into obscurity, their titles meaningless in a world of passports and income taxes. The dynasty that had married its way across Europe now found those very connections useless. Spain's Alfonso XIII, himself a Habsburg descendant, initially offered refuge, but even royal solidarity had limits when republics demanded extradition. The bitterest twist, the Habsburgs had spent centuries believing their family was synonymous with stability. They'd outlasted Napoleon, weathered revolutions, even survived the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But in 1918, they discovered a hard truth. Empires don't fade gracefully, they explode, scattering their rulers to the winds. And sometimes, the smartest survivors aren't those who cling to crowns, but those who learn to live as ordinary people in an ordinary world. Queen Marie of Romania didn't just escape revolution, she orchestrated her family's survival with the precision of a diplomat and the flair of a storyteller. While other royals panicked or clung to outdated notions of privilege, Marie wielded her greatest weapons: charm, connections, and an uncanny ability to turn enemies into allies. When Romania's political landscape fractured in the aftermath of World War I, with communists and nationalists vying for power, the British-born Queen transformed what could have been a frantic flight into a masterclass in strategic retreat. Her first move, leveraging her international prestige. Marie wasn't just a Romanian queen, she was cousin to Britain's King George V and granddaughter of both Queen Victoria and Russia's Alexander II. These ties weren't just family trivia, they were lifelines. As anti-monarchist sentiment grew, she penned urgent letters to foreign ambassadors. her prose dripping with calculated vulnerability. To the French, she emphasized Romania's cultural ties to Europe. To the British, she framed her children's safety as a matter of royal solidarity. And when Bolshevik sympathizers threatened to overrun the palace, she hosted tea for Allied officers, her glittering salons doubling as covert negotiation rooms. Then came the audacious stroke, her decision to flee not in secrecy, but in plain sight. In December 1918, as Bucharest simmered with unrest, Marie boarded a train to Iossi officially to inspect wartime hospitals, unofficially to position her family near the Moldovan border, where loyal troops still held sway. The genius lay in her packaging. She didn't skulk through back alleys. She traveled as a queen on duty, her compartments filled with art crates, later revealed to hold the crown jewels, and her children costumed as Red Cross volunteers. By maintaining the facade of normalcy, she disarmed suspicion. Even her wardrobe played a role. Marie famously wore all white during this period, a visual echo of the good queen persona she'd cultivated in the press. But her true brilliance emerged in the aftermath. When radical factions demanded the family's exile in 1918, Marie didn't resist. She reframed it. Negotiating through intermediaries, she secured not just safe passage to Switzerland, but guarantees that the monarchy's assets, including vital art collections, would follow. Later, when her son Carol controversially returned to claim the throne, it was Marie's carefully maintained relationships with Western powers that lent legitimacy to his reign. The lesson: Marie understood that in the 20th century, royal survival required more than bloodlines. It demanded soft power. Where Louis XVI relied on outdated divine right and Nicholas II on fading imperial loyalty, Marie operated like a modern celebrity statesman. She'd spent years cultivating a public image through wartime nursing, best-selling memoirs, and even a Hollywood-esque tour of America. When crisis came, that goodwill became currency. Her escape wasn't just about crossing borders. It was about ensuring the world would still care when she did. In an age of collapsing crowns, Queen Marie proved that sometimes the best way to run is to make everyone want you to stay. King Constantine I of Greece never expected to rule until a single bullet changed everything. Crowned in 1913 after his father's assassination, he inherited a throne teetering between ancient tradition and modern upheaval. But unlike other monarchs who clung to power as their worlds crumbled, Constantine's story is one of reluctant exits and stubborn comebacks, a cycle of exile and return that mirrored Greece's own turbulent politics. His forced abdication in 1917 wasn't just the fall of a king, it was the beginning of a royal family's decades-long dance with displacement, where influence didn't end at the border. The roots of his downfall lay in World War I. Greece was neutral, but Prime Minister Eleftherios Venizelos pushed for alliance with the Entente, seeing opportunity in the Ottoman Empire's collapse. Constantine, a trained German officer whose wife Sophia was Kaiser Wilhelm II's sister, favored neutrality. This wasn't just policy, it was personal. When Venizelos set up a rival government in Thessaloniki with Allied backing, Greece fractured. By June 1917, French troops occupied Athens, demanding Constantine's abdication. With warships in the harbor and bread riots in the streets, the king faced an impossible choice: resist and risk civil war, or leave and hope to salvage the monarchy. His exit was deceptively dignified. There were no disguises or midnight flights, just a royal convoy to the port of Oropos, where a British vessel waited. But the symbolism was brutal. As Constantine boarded the ship, he turned to his young son Alexander, now the puppet king installed by the Allies, and said, "I hand you the army as I received it, undefeated." The remark cut deep. Greece's military had indeed fought heroically in the Balkan Wars under Constantine's command, But now the king was sailing into exile, his legacy rewritten by his enemies. What followed was exile as political theatre. Constantine settled in Switzerland, but his absence became a rallying cry for royalists. Venizelos's government purged supporters of the old regime, yet the more they tried to erase Constantine, the more he became a mythic figure. The exiled king who'd stood for Greek sovereignty against foreign meddling. His family kept the flame alive. His brother Prince George lobbied in London, while Queen Sophia used her connections to German relatives to monitor post-war realignments. Even from afar, the deposed king's shadow loomed over Greek politics. Then came the twist no one predicted. In 1920, Alexander died from a monkey bite, yes, really, and Venizelos fell from power after losing elections. Suddenly, Greece wanted Constantine back. His return was like something from an epic, crowds tearing up railway tracks to slow his train so more villagers could glimpse him, women throwing their jewelry at his feet to fund his campaign in Asia Minor. But triumph soured quickly. The Greco-Turkish War ended in catastrophe, and by 1922, the king was forced into exile again, this time for good. His son George II took the throne briefly, then fled a republic's rise in 1924, yet the royals never truly left. From London to Rome, Constantine's heirs plotted their return, turning exile into a waiting game. George II was restored in 1935, and the dynasty survived coups, Nazi occupation, and civil war. Even today, Constantine's descendants move through Greek life like ghosts. His son, King Constantine II, lived in London for decades after the monarchy's abolition in 1974, yet his Olympic gold medal, won in 1960 under the name Constantine, Crown Prince of Greece, remains a point of national pride. The lesson: some monarchies don't die, they relocate. Constantine's exiles proved that a throne isn't just a physical seat, but an idea that can cross borders, sustained by loyalty, resentment, and the strange alchemy of memory. Unlike the Romanovs or the Habsburgs, the Greeks never fully severed their royal ties, they just kept rewriting the terms. And in that space between exile and influence, between lost crowns and lingering prestige, the most unexpected royal escapes become possible. Alfonso XIII of Spain spent his entire reign waiting for the explosion, and when it finally came in 1931, even he seemed relieved. For nearly 30 years, the king had presided over a nation perpetually on the brink: military coups, anarchist bombings, colonial wars in Morocco that bled Spain dry. His early years had been marked by optimism, a handsome young monarch modernizing his country, even surviving an assassination attempt on his wedding day. But by the 1920s, the cracks were undeniable. The army's brutal suppression of strikes, the humiliating defeat at Annual in Morocco, the growing republican sentiment in cities, all of it eroded the monarchy's legitimacy. When municipal elections in April 1931 delivered sweeping victories to anti-royalist parties, Alfonso didn't wait for a formal overthrow. He simply left. His departure was as theatrical as it was abrupt. On April 14th, with crowds celebrating in Madrid's Puerta del Sol, the king penned a brief manifesto declaring he was stepping aside to avoid plunging Spain into civil war, then boarded a midnight train to Cartagena with only his personal staff. There, no grand send-off awaited, just a British cruiser, the HMS Enterprise, sent by his cousin George V to discreetly ferry him to France. The symbolism was stark. Spain's Bourbon king, whose ancestors had ruled empires, now depended on foreign navies for safe passage. His final words to the captain: "You're taking aboard a gentleman who has lost everything except his honor." Exile became Alfonso's unexpected second act. Settling first in Paris, then Rome, he transformed from a reigning monarch into a stateless observer, watching as Spain spiraled into civil war. The irony cut deep. He'd been ousted by Republicans, only to see those same Republicans fracture into warring factions, their democracy devoured by Franco's fascists. Alfonso's relationship with Franco was a tense dance. While he privately despised the dictator for usurping what he saw as his family's rightful role, he cautiously supported the nationalists during the Civil War, hoping Franco might restore the monarchy. But the Caudillo had no such plans. For years, Alfonso lived in limbo, hosting exiled aristocrats in his Roman palazzo, while Franco consolidated power, dangling the possibility of restoration like a carrot he'd never let the king bite. Yet Alfonso's greatest legacy wasn't his reign, it was the dynasty he preserved. His grandson Juan Carlos, raised under Franco's supervision as a potential successor, would eventually become the key to the monarchy's revival. The old king, though exiled, had instilled in his heirs the art of survival. He taught Juan Carlos to navigate dictatorship not with open defiance, but with calculated patience, lessons that served him well when Franco finally allowed the monarchy's return in 1975. Alfonso never lived to see it, dying in Rome in 1941, but in a final twist, Spain would reclaim his body in 1980, reburying him with royal honors in El Escorial, the Crypt of Kings. What makes Alfonso's exile unique is its duality. Unlike the Romanovs or the Habsburgs, whose dynasties were obliterated, the Spanish Bourbons endured by becoming ghosts present enough to remain symbols, absent enough to avoid blame. Alfonso's departure wasn't an ending, it was an intermission, and in that space between banishment and return, he proved that sometimes a king's greatest power lies not in ruling, but in waiting. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's golden peacock throne had become a cage. By late 1978, the Shah of Iran, once America's closest Middle Eastern ally, the self-styled modernizer who'd ruled for 37 years, was watching his empire unravel. Riots in Tehran's streets, fueled by economic despair and fury at his secret police, the Savak, had swelled into a revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini's voice crackled from smuggled cassette tapes, calling for the monarchy's overthrow. The Shah, weakened by cancer and indecision, wavered between brutal crackdowns and half-hearted reforms, as if trying to plug a crumbling dam with bandages. His final weeks in power were a masterclass in denial, even as millions marched under black banners chanting, "Death to the Shah." He clung to the belief that Washington would save him. After all, hadn't President Carter toasted him just months earlier as an island of stability? But America's support was crumbling. When the Shah declared martial law in September 1978, his troops opened fire on protesters in Tehran's jail square, killing hundreds. The massacre, forever known as Black Friday, turned global opinion against him, yet in private, he obsessed over trivialities, ordering new uniforms for palace guards, fretting over his peacock insignia's design, as if ceremonial details could distract from the storm outside. The breaking point came in January 1979, with oil strikes paralyzing the economy and military loyalty fraying. The Shah finally accepted the inevitable. On January 16th, he and Empress Farah boarded a plane for Egypt, telling reporters it was a vacation. The lie was transparent. Everyone knew he'd never return. As the Boeing 7 lifted off, Farah wept silently while the Shah stared blankly at Tehran's skyline, the city he'd transformed with skyscrapers and highways now blazing with bonfires of celebration. His departure was so rushed that palace staff later found half-packed suitcases stuffed with jewels, abandoned pets still wandering the halls. Exile became a haunted odyssey. Egypt's President Sadat welcomed them warmly, but the stay was brief. As Khomeini's revolutionaries seized hostages at the U.S. embassy and demanded the Shah's extradition, no nation wanted the taint of harboring him. Morocco next, then the Bahamas, where reporters hounded the frail monarch as he shuffled between beach villas like a ghost. Mexico offered temporary refuge, but when his cancer worsened, the U.S. reluctantly allowed him entry for treatment, a decision that ignited the hostage crisis. Even then, the Carter administration kept him at a military hospital in Texas, treating the man who'd once hosted Nixon on Persian carpets like an unwelcome guest. His final months were a study in isolation. The once proud king, now gaunt from lymphoma, drifted between Panama and Cairo, a man without a country. Former allies distanced themselves. Even his fortune, once estimated at billions, was frozen or looted. When he died in July 1980, only a handful of relatives stood by his Cairo deathbed. No state funeral, no global dignitaries, just a quiet Islamic burial far from the grandeur of Persepolis, where he'd once celebrated 2,500 years of Persian monarchy with obscene extravagance. The cruelest twist, the Shah spent his exile convinced history would vindicate him. In rambling memoirs, he painted himself as a misunderstood reformer betrayed by ungrateful subjects and fickle allies. But revolutions rarely leave room for nuance. His white revolution, land reforms, women's rights, industrialization had been overshadowed by corruption and brutality. The very modernity he championed became a weapon against him, as televised images of Savak tortures fueled global outrage. In the end, the monarch who'd styled himself as Iran's spiritual heir to Cyrus the Great died, as Khomeini's revolutionaries erased his legacy street by street, statue by statue. Yet the Shah's ghost lingers. For older Iranians, he remains a Rorschach test, a brutal autocrat to some, a tragic modernizer to others. His fate stands as a warning to all rulers who mistake stability for loyalty, who think tanks and tear gas can silence the roar of history. Because when the people rise, even kings must run, and sometimes the only thing waiting at the end of that flight is oblivion. Princess Fawzia's story isn't one of dramatic midnight flights or mobs at the palace gates. It's a whisper in the tumultuous history of Egypt's monarchy, a quiet slipping away when the world stopped bowing to kings. By 1952, when the Free Officers' coup toppled King Farouk, Fawzia had already been living in the shadows for years. Once celebrated as Iran's glittering queen during her brief marriage to Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, she'd returned to Egypt, a divorced woman, her name scrubbed from official histories in Tehran, her face no longer gracing postage stamps or newsreels. The revolution that ousted her brother Farouk might have been her moment to flee in panic, but Fawzia didn't run. She faded. Her life had prepared her for this retreat. Even as a young princess, Fawzia preferred books to court gossip, solitude to the spotlight. Her 1939 wedding to the Shah had been a spectacle. Cairo's streets lined with roses, her diamond and pearl tiara dazzling newsreel cameras, but behind the scenes, the marriage was icy. Isolated in Tehran's marble palaces, stifled by Persian court protocols that treated her as a foreigner, she'd battled depression and illness. The birth of a daughter, Princess Shonaz, brought little joy. By 1945, she secured a divorce on grounds so diplomatic they barely caused a ripple. Egyptian climate better suited to Her Highness's health. Returning home, she traded imperial titles for quiet afternoons in Alexandria's gardens, a forgotten relic of a fading world. When the coup came, Fawzia was uniquely positioned to evade notice. Unlike Farouk, whose excesses made him a target, she'd cultivated no enemies, drawn no headlines. As tanks rolled into Cairo that July, she simply packed her jewels, not in desperation, but with the practiced ease of someone who'd always known this day might come. There was no dramatic escape, just a scheduled trip to Switzerland suddenly extended indefinitely. The new revolutionary government, busy confiscating royal estates and prosecuting Farouk's cronies, barely registered her absence. To them, she wasn't a threat, just a middle-aged woman with a passport and a private income. What followed was a life deliberately unremarkable, settling in Alexandria's Smauher district, then later in Switzerland. Fawzia became a master of invisibility. No interviews, no memoirs, no bitter denunciations of the regimes that discarded her. When photographers spotted her in Geneva in the 1960s, she was just another elegant matron sipping coffee, no hint she'd once been a queen. Even her rare public appearances, like her daughter Shonaz's wedding, were orchestrated to avoid politics. She watched from afar as Egypt abolished the monarchy entirely in 1953, as Nasser's republic erased her family's legacy street by street. The irony, in hiding, Fawzia achieved what her brother never could do: dignity in defeat. Farouk died in exile, bloated and broke, his Rome apartment cluttered with uneaten gourmet meals and unpaid bills. Fawzia lived to 91, her composure unbroken, her silence a kind of sovereignty. When she passed in 2013, obituaries called her the last Egyptian princess, but that wasn't quite right. She'd stopped being a princess long before, not when the monarchy fell, but when she realized titles were just costumes, and survival meant knowing when to take them off. Her escape wasn't marked by chaos or chases, but by the quietest rebellion of all, choosing to live not as royalty, but as herself. King Farouk didn't just leave Egypt, he took his entire world with him. When army officers forced his abdication in 1952, the 32-year-old monarch didn't slink away in disgrace. He sailed to Italy aboard the royal yacht Marosa, its decks piled with Louis Quinze furniture, crates of champagne, and his legendary collection of antique watches. This wasn't an escape, it was a relocation. For Farouk, exile became a grotesque parody of kingship, where the trappings of power remained, but the power itself had vanished. Rome's Hotel Excelsior became his stage, Suite 152, a sprawling apartment overlooking the Via Veneto, transformed into a gilded cage where the deposed king held court like a pharaoh in reduced circumstances. He hosted lavish dinners for starlets and sycophants, gorging on 10-course meals while back in Cairo. The new revolutionary government dismantled his dynasty brick by brick. The contrasts were almost comical as Egypt's leaders nationalized industries and redistributed land. Farouk obsessively catalogued his 500 silk pajamas. While peasants rejoiced at the abolition of feudal taxes, he spent afternoons at Bulgari, commissioning custom cigarette lighters studded with emeralds. His excesses weren't just wasteful, they were weaponized. The free officers, particularly Gamal Abdul Nasser, used Farouk's exile antics as propaganda. Secretly filmed footage of the king waddling through casinos, his fingers crusted with rings, played in Cairo's cinemas to justify the revolution. His weight ballooned to nearly 300 pounds, a physical manifestation of gluttony that made him the perfect villain for Egypt's new austerity. Every scoop of foie gras, every case of Dom Pérignon ordered by telephone from Paris, became proof that the monarchy had been a parasite, yet beneath the spectacle lay something darker. Farouk's spending wasn't just indulgence, it was annihilation by extravagance. He knew his fortune wouldn't last. The Swiss accounts, the palazzo in Naples, the fleet of Cadillacs, all were being drained by hangers-on and legal battles as Egypt's new government seized royal assets. So he burned through money like a man trying to outrun his obsolescence. Some purchases were absurd, a solid gold toilet, later stolen by his own bodyguards. Others hinted at desperation, like his attempt to buy Alfa Romeo so he could race under a pseudonym. The boy king who'd ascended the throne at 16, hailed as the hope of the nation, was now a punchline in European tabloids, the king who ate himself. His final years were a slow unraveling. Banished from Egypt, disowned by his own family, his ex-queen Nariman remarried and reclaimed her Egyptian citizenship. Farouk became a spectral figure haunting Rome's nightclubs. The once sharp political operator who'd played British and Italian interests against each other now held court among fraudsters and gold diggers. When he died in 1965, after choking on a 42-course meal, legend claims it was his third supper that night. Even his funeral exposed the hollowness of his exile. No heads of state attended, no Egyptian flags flew at half-mast, just a handful of reporters snapping photos as his coffin, too large for a standard hearse, was hauled to Rome's Protestant cemetery on a flatbed truck. Farouk's tragedy wasn't that he lost his throne, it was that he never understood why. To the end, he believed revolution was a personal slight, not a historical reckoning. While other fallen monarchs adapted or reflected, he doubled down on the very decadence that doomed him, mistaking appetite for sovereignty. His exile stands as history's most garish cautionary tale. When the world stops bowing, no amount of gold can buy back your dignity. Emperor Bao Dai's reign was already a shadow of its former glory when the communist tide swept through Vietnam. Crowned in 1932 under French colonial rule, he'd spent years as a puppet monarch, his imperial edicts dictated by foreign powers. By 1945, when Ho Chi Minh declared independence and abolished the monarchy, Bao Dai's throne had become little more than a ceremonial relic. Yet his final exit, when it came, wasn't marked by a dramatic stand or a desperate flight, but by weary resignation to history's tide. The French, desperate to reclaim their colony after World War II, reinstalled Bao Dai in 1949 as head of state of a non-communist Vietnam. But this was monarchy in name only. From the lush hills of Dalat, where he hunted tigers and hosted champagne-soaked soirees, the emperor ruled nothing. His government, propped up by French guns and American dollars, controlled shrinking territories while Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh guerrillas tightened their grip on the countryside. Even his subjects mocked him as the playboy emperor, more interested in his mistresses and sports cars than the bloody war ravaging his country. When the French collapsed at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Bao Dai's fate was sealed. The Geneva Accords partitioned Vietnam, and his prime minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, saw no need for a figurehead. In a rigged referendum in 1955, Diem claimed 98% of the vote to depose the emperor, a result so absurd even American advisors cringed. Bao Dai, ever the pragmatist, didn't resist. Packing his collection of rare coins and custom Savile Row suits, he boarded a flight to Paris with his family, sparing barely a glance for the country he'd nominally ruled for over 2 decades. Exile became an endless dusk. Settling in a villa on the French Riviera, Bao Dai split his time between Cannes casinos and quiet dinners with fellow deposed royals, Spain's Alfonso XIII, Italy's Umberto II. Unlike Farouk's garish spectacles or the Romanovs' tragic end, his banishment was marked by eerie normalcy. He dabbled in business ventures, a failed perfume line, an abandoned scheme to market Vietnamese cinnamon, wrote bland memoirs that blamed everyone but himself, and watched as Vietnam burned without him. The cruelest twist, Bao Dai outlived all the men who'd usurped him. Diem was assassinated in 1963. Ho Chi Minh died in 1969, his dream of reunification achieved only after years of carnage. The emperor, smoking cigars in his Paris apartment, became a living anachronism, a man who'd been irrelevant for so long, even history forgot to claim him. His final years were spent petitioning for the return of family assets seized by Hanoi, a futile quest that ended with his death in 1997. No state funeral, no imperial honors, just a quiet grave in Passy Cemetery. far from the jade hills of Hue where his ancestors lay. Bao Dai's story isn't one of resistance or reinvention, but of surrender to colonialism, to revolution, to oblivion. He wasn't a tyrant or a martyr, just a man who mistook privilege for power and leisure for legacy. In the end, his greatest achievement was proving how quietly a throne can vanish when no one cares enough to defend it. King Zog of Albania didn't just flee his country, he turned escape into spectacle. When Mussolini's forces invaded in April 1939, the self-proclaimed King of the Albanians had known war was coming. For years, he'd played a dangerous game, balancing Italian loans with secret overtures to Britain, all while Mussolini's propaganda painted him as a backward tribal chieftain undeserving of a throne. But nothing prepared Tirana for the sheer speed of the Italian Blitz. As bombers darkened the skies and tanks rolled across the Adriatic coast, Zog faced a choice few monarchs had confronted so starkly: fight and die, or run and live to fight another day, with his treasury intact. His escape was chaos dressed as strategy. With Italian troops just miles from the capital, Zog loaded his heavily pregnant wife, Queen Geraldine, into a bulletproof Mercedes alongside their 2-day-old son, Crown Prince Leka. Behind them stretched a convoy worthy of a Hollywood heist: trucks stuffed with gold bars from the National Bank, crates of state jewels, even the king's personal stamp collection. Every inch of space held something of value, from diplomatic files to silver dinnerware engraved with the royal crest. As the motorcade snaked through mountain passes toward the Greek border, Zog's guards spread rumors of decoy convoys to throw off assassins. The theatrics weren't just for show. This was a man who'd survived 55 assassination attempts as president before declaring himself king. He understood the price on his head. The journey itself was a nightmare of close calls. Italian planes strafed the roads, forcing the royal party to ditch their cars and continue on foot through rugged terrain. Queen Geraldine, still bleeding from childbirth, collapsed twice from exhaustion. At one point, Zog reportedly bribed a group of bandits with gold coins to secure safe passage, an irony not lost on the king who'd once jailed their leaders. When they finally crossed into Greece, the Albanian crown jewels were sewn into the linings of servants' coats, the gold dispersed among loyalist luggage. The Greeks, wary of provoking Mussolini, granted them just 24 hours before urging them onward. What followed was exile as performance art. Zog hopscotched across Europe, Turkey, Romania, France, always one step ahead of Italian agents and ever-shifting political winds. In Paris, he booked entire hotel floors under aliases, hosting Balkan dissidents in suites guarded by former royal gendarmes. He even flirted with Hollywood, allegedly considering a film deal about his life starring Cary Grant. But the real drama centered on his treasure. The gold he'd salvaged became a lifeline, funding shadow governments in exile and intelligence networks. When Germany invaded France in 1940, Zog relocated to England, where his funds allegedly helped finance resistance groups back home. The war's end brought no triumphant return. With communists seizing Albania in 1944, Zog became a relic overnight. His London mansion became a sad parody of court life. Petitioners from defunct Balkan monarchies sipping tea, while Tito's Yugoslavia recognized Enver Hoxha's regime. The king spent years suing the Bank of England for access to Albania's pre-war gold reserves, a legal battle he'd lose spectacularly in 1953. By then, he'd relocated to Egypt, where King Farouk, another deposed monarch, gifted him a Nile-side villa. The two fallen kings spent evenings comparing notes on their bad luck. Though Zog, ever the pragmatist, had one advantage: he still had his jewels. His final years in France were a study in stubborn denial. Refusing to abdicate, he issued royal decrees from a suburban Paris villa, appointing ministers to a government that existed only on paper. When he died in 1961, Albanian state radio dismissed him as the fugitive Zorg, but his legacy was more complex. Unlike Farouk or Romania's Carol, he'd never been a true autocrat, just a clever survivor who bet wrong on the tides of history. And in one final twist, his son Leka would spend decades trying to reclaim the throne, even staging a farcical royal return in 1997 amid Albania's post-communist chaos. The crowds cheered, the police arrested him, and the world was reminded some royal escapes never really end. Prince Felix Yusupov could have lived a life of endless luxury instead. He chose murder and revolution, then barely escaped with his skin. Of all Russia's aristocrats, none embodied the excess and audacity of the doomed Romanov era like the Yusupovs. Their fortune, rumored to dwarf even the Tsars, included Siberian gold mines, a private theatre with costumes by Fabergé, and a St. Petersburg palace where the stair banisters were solid amber. But Felix, the family's flamboyant heir, didn't want to be remembered as just another spoiled prince. His name would be etched in history for something far darker, the assassination of Rasputin. That December night in 1916 changed everything. Felix lured the mad monk to his Moika palace basement with promises of meeting his beautiful wife, Irina. What followed was a botched execution straight out of a horror story, poisoned cakes untouched, bullets that didn't kill, Rasputin finally drowning in an icy river after surviving multiple gunshot wounds. The murder, intended to save Russia from Rasputin's influence over Tsarina Alexandra, backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening the monarchy, it fueled conspiracy theories and deepened the royal family's isolation. Within months, revolution would topple the Romanovs, and Felix's notoriety made him a marked man. When Bolsheviks stormed St. Petersburg in 1917, they came for the Yusupovs with particular fury. Felix's palace was ransacked, his art collection looted, his name plastered on wanted posters as an enemy of the people, but Felix had been preparing. For years, his mother Zenaida had quietly transferred jewels out of Russia, hiding them in bank vaults from Paris to New York. Now, as Red Guards burst into their homes, Felix and Irina wore specially tailored coats lined with diamonds and pearls, their pockets stuffed with loose emeralds sewn into the seams. Even their dog's collar concealed rubies. Their escape was a masterclass in aristocratic cool. Disguised as peasants, they took a train to Crimea, where Yusupov Properties still had loyal staff, then boarded a British warship to Malta. The journey was fraught with danger. At one point, Bolshevik inspectors almost discovered their hidden gems when a guard noticed Irina's two elegant hands. Felix bribed him with a single diamond button, whispering, "For your silence." By the time they reached Paris in 1919, they'd lost their country but salvaged a sliver of their fortune, enough to buy a house near the Bois de Boulogne and live comfortably, if not regally. Yet Felix couldn't outrun his past. He published sensational memoirs admitting to Rasputin's murder, turning himself into a bizarre celebrity. Tourists flocked to see him at Parisian cafes, while Soviet propagandists painted him as a decadent killer. Even in exile, he played the provocateur suing MGM over Rasputin film's portrayal of Irina, then blowing the settlement on parties. The jewels that funded his new life slowly vanished, sold off to pay for his endless lawsuits and gambling debts. By his death in 1967, the man who'd once owned Rembrandts was reduced to selling autographed photos of Rasputin's corpse. The irony, Felix's greatest escape wasn't from the Bolsheviks, it was from obscurity. While other exiled nobles faded into quiet poverty, he weaponized his infamy, ensuring history would never forget the prince who killed a legend. Those smuggled jewels bought him time, but his audacity bought him immortality. In the end, Felix Yusupov didn't just flee a revolution. He staged his own endless performance, with the world as his captive audience. Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna's survival depended on a single rule: never look like royalty. By early 1918, as Bolshevik forces tightened their grip on Russia, the Grand Duchess had already watched her world crumble. Her cousin Nicholas II's family were prisoners, her palaces seized, her friends vanishing into the night. Most of the Romanovs waited too long, clinging to hope until escape was impossible. Maria chose a different path. She became someone else. Her transformation began in a dingy Kiev apartment, where the 58-year-old aristocrat traded silk gowns for a peasant's rough woolen dress. A trusted servant stained her hands with chemicals to mimic the calluses of a laborer, while her lady-in-waiting cropped Maria's hair into a blunt, unfashionable bob. The Grand Duchess, who'd once hosted emperors in marble ballrooms, now practiced walking with the slouched shoulders of a weary farmwife. Every detail mattered: the way she held her battered tin cup, the coarse wool stockings that scratched her skin, even the slight regional accent she adopted to explain her journey. The escape route was a perilous maze, with forged papers identifying her as Madame Petrova. Maria joined a stream of refugees fleeing south toward the Black Sea. She traveled by ox cart, by crowded third-class train compartments, and on foot through mud-choked backroads. At checkpoints, Bolshevik soldiers barely glanced at the worn-looking woman with dirt under her nails, too busy harassing wealthier-looking fugitives. Only once did panic nearly undo her when a Red Army officer grabbed her wrist, demanding to know why her work-roughened hands had such delicate bones. Maria burst into tears, sobbing about her dead husband's failed farm, and the embarrassed man let her pass, but the real test came at the Romanian border. With White Russian forces still holding pockets of territory, the crossing teemed with spies and deserters. Maria's group hired a smuggler who led them through moonlit forests, avoiding patrols by following the howls of his trained dogs. When they finally reached safety in Iossi, the Grand Duchess collapsed, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer mental toll of maintaining her disguise for weeks. A local aristocrat, recognizing her despite the rags, gasped, "Your Imperial Highness." Maria silenced him with a look. The act wasn't over yet. Her journey didn't end in Romania. With Bolshevik agents hunting Romanov survivors across Europe, Maria moved again, this time to Switzerland under yet another alias. What's astonishing isn't just her escape, it's what she saved. Hidden in the false bottom of her tattered suitcase were the famous Vladimir emeralds, sewn into a corset only she could wear. Those jewels would fund her exile, allowing her to live quietly while less pragmatic relatives begged for handouts. In a final twist, Maria outlived most of her family, dying peacefully in 1920 at 61, an age few Romanovs reached after the revolution. Her story stands apart because it reveals the key to surviving regime change: adaptability. While others relied on loyalty or divine right, Maria understood that in revolutions, privilege becomes a death warrant. She didn't just flee, she erased herself, proving that sometimes the greatest act of nobility is choosing to disappear. King Michael of Romania never expected the crown to weigh so heavily. When he first became king at just 18 in 1927, it was a ceremonial role under his father's shadow. But by 1940, with Europe at war and Romania caught between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, Michael found himself thrust into real power only to have it torn away twice, first by fascists, then by communists. His final act as king, though, wasn't a grand stand or a bloody last defense. It was a quiet signature under duress, a moment that would haunt him for decades as he became the last monarch behind the Iron Curtain to lose his throne. The end came on December 30th, 1947. Soviet-backed communists had spent years tightening their grip on Romania, dismantling democratic institutions and purging opposition. Michael, who had courageously overthrown the fascist dictator Ion Antonescu in 1944 to switch Romania's allegiance to the Allies, now faced an even more insidious threat. Prime Minister Petru Groza and Communist leader Gheorghe Gheorghiu Dij summoned him to Bucharest's Elisabeta Palace under false pretenses. Isolated and surrounded by armed troops, the 26-year-old king was given an ultimatum: abdicate immediately or face the execution of over 1,000 arrested students and monarchists. As if to underscore the threat, the communists had already cut phone lines to the palace and stationed tanks outside. What followed was a chilling pantomime of choice. Michael was handed a pre-written abdication document, its ink still wet. Refusal meant bloodshed, compliance meant exile. With a shaking hand, he signed away his throne, later describing the moment as like signing my own death warrant. The communists, eager to erase all traces of monarchy, even forced him to sign a separate document renouncing all royal assets, including his family's sprawling estates and the crown jewels. By nightfall, he was bundled onto a train with his mother, Queen Helen, and a handful of loyal aides. No fanfare, no farewells, just the cold reality of a royal family reduced to stateless refugees. Exile in Switzerland became a life of restrained defiance. Settling in Verswa near Geneva, Michael refused to fade into obscurity like so many deposed royals. He adopted the unassuming title of Prince Michael of Romania, but his home became a hub for exiled Romanians and anti-communist activists. The regime in Bucharest, paranoid about his lingering influence, banned his name from newspapers and history books, yet whispers of his resistance persisted. In 1992, after the fall of communism, Michael's first visit to Romania drew over 1 million people into the streets, proof that 45 years of repression hadn't erased his legacy. The bitter irony, the communists who forced him out had unwittingly made him a martyr. While they rewrote history to paint the monarchy as decadent and obsolete, Michael lived quietly among Swiss vineyards, his dignity intact. He worked as a test pilot, gave interviews about Romania's stolen democracy, and even sued the government in the 1950s to reclaim confiscated properties, a case he lost, but one that kept his cause alive internationally. His steadfast refusal to abdicate voluntarily despite offers to return as a figurehead under communist rule cemented his reputation as a man who valued principle over power. In his later years, Michael became a living bridge between Romania's past and its post-communist future. Though the government refused to restore the monarchy, they returned some royal properties and granted him honorary privileges. When he passed in 2017 at 96, Romania gave him a state funeral fit for a king, his coffin draped in the royal standard, his decades of exile finally over. The boy who'd been bullied into abdication outlived the regime that destroyed his throne, a quiet testament to the resilience of loyalty over brute force. His story isn't just about loss, it's about the slow, stubborn victory of memory over erasure. Princess Fawzia's story begins with a fairy tale and ends with a fracture. The stunning Iranian-German beauty, who captured the Shah's heart in 1950, became Queen of Persia at 20, her fairy-tale wedding dazzling the world. But by 1979, as revolution consumed Iran, she found herself on the wrong side of history, not as a villain, but as a ghost of the Shah's doomed era. Unlike other exiled royals who fled with family or treasure, Fawzia had already been cast aside years earlier for failing to produce an heir. Her exile was a double banishment from her country and from the dynasty she'd once symbolized. The revolution stripped her of everything but her name. Though divorced from Mohammad Reza Pahlavi since 1958, Soraya's identity remained inextricably tied to the throne. As mobs burned effigies of the Shah in Tehran, his former queen became a target by association. Her Tehran villa was ransacked, her portraits slashed in museums, her very existence scrubbed from official narratives. With no children to anchor her claim, no political role to justify her presence, she became an afterthought in the chaos until the death threats began arriving at her Rome apartment. The message was clear: no one linked to the Pahlavis would be safe. What followed was a life of glittering isolation. Settling in Paris, Soraya moved through the city's elite circles like a phantom attending film premieres in Dior, photographed at opera galas, yet always hovering at the edges of high society. The European press dubbed her the Sad Queen, a title she despised but couldn't escape. Magazine covers splashed her face alongside headlines about the Shah's excesses, as if her glamour somehow explained Iran's revolution. In private, she cultivated an air of mystery, granting few interviews but hinting at regrets in her memoir. "I lost a crown but kept my soul," she wrote, a defiant line that rang hollow when creditors seized her jewelry in the 1980s. The cruelest twist: Soraya's exile was punctuated by brief, surreal reunions with the very world that rejected her. When the Shah died in 1980, she attended his Cairo funeral against advice, standing silently beside Farah, the woman who'd replaced her. Later, she became an unwitting pawn in the Islamic Republic's propaganda. Her image used to highlight the Pahlavis' moral decay, yet she never remarried, never had children, never fully escaped the golden cage of her title. Even her final years in Paris were shadowed by legal battles over unpaid taxes and dwindling funds, a far cry from the days when she'd inspired Balmain's Persian-inspired collections. When Soraya passed away in 2001, her funeral drew more paparazzi than mourners. No Iranian officials acknowledged her death, no streets were renamed in her memory. Yet in Europe, obituaries fixated on her beauty and tragedy, reducing her life to a series of black and white photographs: the young queen in her coronation tiara, the exiled icon sipping champagne alone at Maxim's. They missed the real story. Soraya's exile wasn't just about losing a throne, it was about becoming a footnote in someone else's revolution, a woman forever defined by what she'd ceased to be. In the end, her greatest escape might have been from the world's relentless nostalgia, the endless demand to play a queen long after the kingdom had crumbled. The story of Greece's royal family isn't one of a single exile, but a series of departures and returns, each more unpredictable than the last. After King Constantine I's forced abdication in 1917, the crown passed like a hot coal between relatives: his son Alexander, his brother George, even his second son George II, who inherited a throne that seemed more burden than privilege. But no matter who wore it, Greece's monarchy remained caught between warring factions: republicans who saw kings as relics, and royalists who believed only a crown could hold the fractious nation together. This tug-of-war played out in hotel suites and foreign embassies, with the royals becoming experts in the art of packing suitcases and reading political winds. Take George II, Constantine's eldest son, who was crowned in 1922, only to be overthrown 18 months later when a military coup declared Greece a republic. His departure was so abrupt, he left behind half his wardrobe in Athens' royal palace. For the next 11 years, he drifted through London apartments, Romanian hunting lodges, even a stint in Florence, where he survived on handouts from sympathetic aristocrats. This wasn't the lavish exile of Farouk or Alfonso. George lived like a middle-class expatriate, pawning family heirlooms to pay rent. Yet in a twist worthy of Greek tragedy, the same republic that banished him would beg him to return in 1935 after a string of unstable governments collapsed. The plebiscite that restored him won 98% approval, proving how quickly history's pendulum could swing, but homecomings in Greece were never permanent. When World War II erupted, George fled again, this time alongside his government as Nazis occupied Athens. From a cramped London office, he became a king without a kingdom, broadcasting encouragement to Greek resistance fighters while British officials treated him as a nuisance. His death in 1947 alone in a modest Athens apartment, his reign bookended by exiles, symbolized the monarchy's precarious state. Even in death, controversy followed. His funeral procession was disrupted by leftist protesters hurling stones, a grim preview of the civil war about to tear Greece apart. The next generation fared no better. George's brother Paul, who succeeded him, spent his early reign dodging assassination attempts and communist insurgents, only to see his son Constantine II deposed by a military junta in 1967. This time, the exile stuck. The junta's propaganda painted Constantine as a bumbling playboy, while the king himself botched a counter-coup attempt before fleeing to Rome with his family. What followed was decades of limbo court, in-exile intrigues, lawsuits over confiscated property, and the slow erosion of royal prestige. By the time Greece voted to abolish the monarchy for good in 1974, even former supporters had moved on. Yet the royals never fully disappeared. From their London base, Constantine's family refashioned themselves into modern European aristocrats. His sister Sophia married Spain's Juan Carlos. His son Pavlos became a fixture in society magazines. The crown was gone, but the name still held cachet. When Constantine returned to Greece in the 1980s as a private citizen, he was greeted by cheering crowds, not as a king, but as a nostalgic symbol of a bygone era. His Olympic gold medal in sailing, won as a prince in 1960, became a point of national pride, allowing him to reclaim a sliver of Greek identity without the burden of a throne. The Greek royals' survival strategy was always adaptability. Unlike the Romanovs, who clung to absolutism until the end, or the Balkan monarchs who vanished into obscurity, they learned to bend without breaking. They became citizens of the world, leveraging their connections to stay relevant even as their political power evaporated. Today, their descendants move through European high society with ease, their exile no longer a wound but a footnote proof that sometimes the smartest way to keep a crown is to stop insisting on wearing it. King Simon II of Bulgaria was only 6 years old when he inherited a throne already crumbling under the weight of war and political turmoil. Crowned in 1943, after his father's sudden death, the boy king's reign lasted just 3 years before a Soviet-backed referendum abolished the monarchy in 1946. Forced into exile with his mother and sister, Simon left Sofia with little more than the clothes on his back, a child deposed before he could even grasp what it meant to rule. But this wouldn't be the last time Bulgaria heard his name. Decades later, long after most assumed the monarchy was dead, he would stage one of history's most improbable political comebacks, not as a king, but as a democratically elected leader in the very country that had exiled him. The family's flight was a scramble of desperation. With communist forces tightening their grip, Queen Giovanna smuggled her children out of Bulgaria under the guise of a countryside vacation. From there, they slipped across the border to Turkey, then Egypt, where relatives in Italy's royal family offered temporary shelter. By 1951, they'd settled in Madrid, living on the charity of exiled European aristocrats. Young Simon grew up between worlds, a king without a kingdom, fluent in 6 languages yet rootless, his childhood marked by abrupt transitions from palace nurseries to modest boarding schools. But unlike other deposed royals who clung to nostalgia, Simon adapted. He attended military academy in the United States, worked in banking and business, and married a Spanish aristocrat, deliberately building a life outside the shadow of his lost crown. Then came the fall of the Iron Curtain. When communism collapsed in 1989, Bulgaria emerged shaky but hopeful, its new leaders promising democracy after 45 years of single-party rule. For Simon, now in his 50s, the moment sparked an audacious idea. What if he returned not to reclaim a throne, but to serve his homeland in a new way? In 1996, he stepped onto Bulgarian soil for the first time in half a century, greeted by crowds of curious onlookers and emotional monarchists. But instead of waving a royal banner, he spoke of economic reform, transparency, and European integration, language that resonated in a country weary of corruption. The gamble paid off. In 2001, Simon formed a political party and ran for Prime Minister under the simple slogan, "Simon, a new way." Critics scoffed, how could an exile, let alone a former king, understand the struggles of ordinary Bulgarians? But his campaign tapped into a deep hunger for change. He promised to return confiscated property, attract foreign investment, and bridge Bulgaria's divisions. To everyone's shock, his party won a landslide victory, making him the first monarch in modern history to reclaim power through the ballot box. For 4 years, King Simon II, now Prime Minister Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, governed as a pragmatic reformer, navigating the messy realities of post-communist politics. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The boy who'd fled Bulgaria in fear now sat in the same presidential palace where communist leaders had once plotted his family's erasure. Yet his tenure was far from a fairy tale. Economic reforms sparked protests, coalition infighting weakened his government, and by 2005, voters turned to newer faces. But Simon's story didn't end with electoral defeat. He'd proven something remarkable, that a king could reinvent himself as a servant of democracy, and that exile, rather than severing ties, could forge a deeper commitment to home. Today, retired from politics but still a respected elder statesman, he embodies a paradox, a man who lost a crown but gained a country, not by conquest or birthright, but by the quiet power of return. Puyi's story is one of the most astonishing falls from power in modern history, a man who was crowned emperor before he could walk, only to end his life planting flowers in a Beijing park. Born in 1906, he ascended China's dragon throne at just 2 years old, a child ruler propped up by eunuchs and regents while the Qing dynasty crumbled around him. His reign lasted only 3 years before revolution toppled the imperial system in 1911, yet his journey was far from over. Stripped of his title, but allowed to live in luxury within the forbidden city's gilded cage, young Puyi grew up believing he was still heaven's chosen sovereign until even that illusion was ripped away. The warlord era turned him into a pawn. In 1924, a rebellious general expelled him from the palace, forcing the 18-year-old last emperor into a world he'd never navigated alone. For years, he drifted between foreign concessions and Japanese sympathizers, a relic desperate for relevance. Then came the offer that would define his legacy. Japan's puppet state of Manchukuo needed a figurehead. In 1932, Puyi became Emperor Kang'd, a hollow title, masking brutal occupation. Lavish ceremonies couldn't disguise the truth. He was a prisoner in all but name, his every move controlled by Japanese advisors, his signature rubber-stamping atrocities. When Soviet troops captured him in 1945, footage showed a trembling man in thick glasses, pleading not to be shot. What followed was a decade of reinvention or survival. Held in a Soviet prison camp, Puyi traded imperial airs for menial chores, learning to sweep floors and darn socks. His captors treated him more as a curiosity than a criminal. even letting him testify at the Tokyo trials. But the real transformation came after his repatriation to communist China in 1950. Expecting execution, he instead faced years of re-education, writing confessional autobiographies under state supervision. The boy who'd once demanded servants kowtow now tended vegetables in a labor camp, his past dissected in propaganda films. Miraculously, he adapted. Granted amnesty in 1959, Puyi embraced his new role as Citizen Puyi, working as a gardener and archivist. Tourists visiting the Beijing Botanical Garden in the 1960s would never guess the unassuming man pruning roses had once dined from golden plates carried by kneeling attendants. He even remarried, a nurse named Lai Shuxian, who later joked about teaching the ex-emperor how to boil water. His memoir, From Emperor to Citizen, became a bestseller, though historians debate how much was genuine repentance and how much was survival. The irony is inescapable. The man whose name once inspired reverence died in 1967 as just another casualty of the Cultural Revolution, his funeral attended by a handful of relatives. Today, his story is a Rorschach test. Was he a collaborator, a victim, or a warning about the fleeting nature of power? Puyi's life reminds us that no throne is permanent, and sometimes the greatest escape isn't from a palace, but from the weight of your own history. Princess Ashraf Pahlavi had spent decades as Iran's most formidable woman, ruthlessly political, fabulously wealthy, and unapologetically bold. But on the morning of January 16, 1979, as her twin brother the Shah fled Tehran, she faced a revolutionary mob with no palace guards left to protect her. The streets outside her apartment seethed with chants of "Death to the Pahlavis" and the scent of burning tires. Ashraf, once dubbed the Black Panther for her dark glamour and iron will, now stood alone in a dressing gown, clutching a suitcase stuffed with cash and jewels. Her survival hinged on one grim calculation: who in this new, hostile Iran could still be bribed. Her escape plan was a masterclass in cold-blooded pragmatism. While the Shah's departure had been a chaotic scramble, Ashraf had spent weeks preparing. She'd quietly transferred millions to Swiss accounts, secured foreign passports for her children, and memorized the phone numbers of military officers whose loyalty might stretch beyond ideology. When the crisis hit, she didn't waste time on sentiment. A single call to a disgruntled Air Force commander, a man she knew resented the revolution's purges, secured a military plane at Mehrabad Airport. The price, $200,000 in cash, and a promise to help his family relocate to France. Negotiating with vultures, she later confessed in her memoirs, was the only language left to us. The drive to the airport was a gauntlet of terror. With her daughter clutched beside her, Ashraf's Mercedes crawled through checkpoints manned by armed teenagers. At one stop, a revolutionary guard pressed his face against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he scrutinized the heavily veiled woman inside. Ashraf's chauffeur, trained for this moment, slipped the young man a wad of bills and a gold cigarette case, a gift from the people's struggle. The guard smirked, pocketed the loot, and waved them through. It was a tactic she'd honed for years. In a country where civil servants earned pittances, corruption could be a lifeline, but the real test came at the tarmac. The promised military plane sat engines running, its crew sweating under the gaze of newly appointed revolutionary overseers. Ashraf's contact had kept his word, but the presence of armed ideologues threatened everything. Here, her legendary temper became an asset. Storming past the guards with the imperious fury of a woman who'd once bullied cabinet ministers, she barked orders in the tone of someone who expected obedience. "I am traveling on state business," she lied, flashing a diplomatic passport from the Shah's last-ditch appointments. The hesitation in the guard's eyes lasted just seconds long enough for her to shove past and climb the stairs, her daughter scrambling behind. The plane took off as gunfire echoed across the airport. Hours later, when they landed in Paris, Ashraf didn't look back. While her brother wandered between temporary refuges, she set about rebuilding her influence with the same calculated aggression that had defined her life. Within months, she'd leveraged her remaining fortune into lobbying efforts, funding monarchist groups, and even courting American senators to oppose Khomeini's regime. The princess who'd escaped with nothing but a suitcase would spend the next decades battling the revolution from afar, not with armies, but with checkbooks, connections, and the unshakable certainty that money could buy more than escape. It could buy revenge, yet for all her cunning, Ashraf's story carries an uncomfortable truth. The very tactics that saved her bribery, bullying, a lifetime of treating people as tools, were what made the Pahlavis so hated in the first place. Her escape wasn't just a narrow escape from revolution. It was the final act of a system that believed power and wealth could outrun history, and in that, she proved both its most ruthless survivor and its ultimate relic. King Edward VIII's abdication in 1936 was meant to be his grand romantic exit, trading a crown for the woman he loved, but within years, that fairy tale curdled into something darker, as the former monarch and Wally Simpson found themselves entangled with the very forces threatening Britain's survival. Their post-abdication life wasn't just one of quiet exile, it became a geopolitical minefield, with whispers of treason, clandestine meetings, and a desperate flight from the fallout of their own poor judgment. The trouble began almost immediately after they settled in France. Edward, bitter over his family's cold reception of Wally's, and resentful of his brother George VI's ascension, became alarmingly cozy with Nazi sympathizers. By 1937, just months after abdicating, the couple made a notorious visit to Germany, where they were feted by high-ranking Nazis, including a private meeting with Hitler at his Berghof retreat. Photos of the Duke and Duchess smiling alongside uniformed officers made front pages worldwide, their champagne toasts in Munich beer halls looking increasingly sinister as Europe hurtled toward war. Edward even praised Hitler's labor policies in interviews, while Wally's correspondence revealed disturbing admiration for the regime's efficiency. When war broke out in 1939, their allegiances became a security nightmare. British intelligence intercepted coded messages from Wally's to Nazi contacts, some referencing Edward's loose lips about Allied defenses. One memo even suggested the Duke had leaked French troop positions during their brief posting, their information that could have aided Germany's devastating blitzkrieg. Winston Churchill, desperate to neutralize the scandal, offered Edward the governorship of the Bahamas, a tropical exile far from sensitive war zones. The posting was framed as an honor, but everyone understood its true purpose: to keep the reckless ex-king from becoming a propaganda tool for the enemy. Their time in Nassau was a gilded purgatory. Edward chafed at the heat and the petty responsibilities, while Wally sneered at the provincial society, her letters dripping with contempt for the colonial outpost. Meanwhile, the Nazis spun their absence from Europe as evidence of British persecution, broadcasting false claims that the couple were prisoners of Buckingham Palace. The truth was far messier. Edward still dreamed of a political comeback, whispering to visitors about brokering peace with Hitler if Britain's situation grew dire. Only the Allies' eventual victory extinguished those dangerous fantasies. After the war, the Windsors became permanent exiles, drifting between Paris and New York, their reputations forever tarnished. French high society tolerated them, but old friends kept their distance, wary of the stench of collaboration. Edward's memoirs, published in 1951, carefully sidestepped his wartime missteps, while Wally's focused on cultivating her image as a fashion icon, a deliberate distraction from the uglier chapters of their past. Their final years were a study in lavish irrelevance, their names synonymous less with romance than with recklessness. The cruelest twist: Edward had once been Britain's darling, the young king who charmed crowds with his modernity. But by choosing Wally's over duty, then flirting with fascism over loyalty, he didn't just lose a throne, he sacrificed his place in history. Their story isn't about love conquering all, but about privilege blinding them to consequence. And in the end, even their glamorous exile couldn't outshine the shadows they'd embraced. From gilded palaces to midnight escapes, the stories of monarchs on the run reveal a haunting pattern. Survival demanded more than wealth or divine right. It required shedding crowns like old skins, trading velvet robes for peasant smocks, and learning to bow to forces far stronger than tradition. These weren't just physical flights across borders, they were metamorphoses where kings became refugees and queens turned into actresses playing ordinary women. The French Revolution taught us how quickly loyalty evaporates when hunger gnaws at the streets. The Romanovs' tragedy showed the fatal cost of hesitation. And figures like Bulgaria's Simon proved that exile could be a prelude to rebirth, not just an ending. What unites these stories isn't just the chaos of revolution, but the raw humanity beneath the ermine. Marie Antoinette sewing jewels into her petticoats, Puyi tending communist vegetable patches, or King Michael signing his abdication with a gun at his back. These moments strip away the myth of monarchy, revealing people grappling with the same fears as anyone facing oblivion. The difference: their falls were amplified by history, their choices dissected as allegories for entire systems collapsing, yet their escapes left fingerprints on our world. The Shah's downfall fueled decades of geopolitical tension. Edward VIII's abdication reshaped Britain's modern monarchy, and every smuggled crown jewel, every secret alliance forged in exile, became a thread in the tapestry of 20th century history. These weren't just personal dramas, they were hinges upon which nations turned, so now we turn to you. Which of these escapes left you breathless? Was it the audacity of Zog's gold-filled convoy, the quiet dignity of Michael of Romania, or the surreal spectacle of Farouk's endless feasts? Drop your pick in the comments, and while you're there, imagine this: if you'd been born with a crown, would you have fought, fled, or reinvented yourself? The answer says as much about you as it does about history's fallen royals.